Fowler, and I'd like to welcome you to Green Square Booksellers in Bellows Falls. And we are very pleased to have Chard DeNiord here today. And I'm going to give you a little bit of his background. He earned a BA degree in Religious Studies from Lynchburg College, a Master's of Divinity in Yale Divinity School, and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. He was co-founder of the New England College MFA program in poetry, and he's the author of numerous poetry collections such as Asleep in the Fire, Sharp Golden Thread, Night Mowing, which we do have, The Double Truth. His book Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, and Stapled Songs is a collection of interviews with American poets, including Robert Bly, Lucille Clifton, Jack Gilbert, Donald Hall, Galway Kinnell, Maxine Kuhlman, and Ruth Stone. He has been a poetry fellow at the Sewanee Writers Conference and the Alan Collins Scholar in Poetry at the Breadloaf Writers Conference. He's a recipient of a Pushcart Prize, and his poems have been included in numerous anthologies. Currently, I think, still teaching at Providence College?
Still teaching.
In Providence, Rhode Island. He lives in Putney, our neighbor here, just to the south. And in late 2015, he was named Poet Laureate of Vermont, and perhaps he can tell us a little bit about what it means to be Poet Laureate. We've had Grace Paley here, so you're not the first Poet Laureate that's
she's
visited
wonderful.
us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. And happy to read a few poems and maybe a few sentences from this new book of interviews. And if you folks have any questions about some of these interviews or the poems, I'd be happy to talk to you about them. This new book, I guess, which is out officially next week, is called "I Would Lie to You If I Could," which is actually a line from a James Wright poem, "To the Muse." I was going to call it something boring title like "Voices Amidst the Crowd," but decided at the last minute to go with this. So maybe I'll read just a few snippets from these interviews just to give you an idea of what it was like to talk to some of these folks, and then 7 or 8 poems, and then please feel free to ask me anything you'd like. I included my interview with Galway Kinnell in this book because he left out most of the good stuff in my first interview with him that when he edited from this book, not most, I mean, but a lot of really interesting details about his life, his near-death experiences, his civil rights work, and so forth. And then he passed away, and I asked his widow, Bobby Bristol, if we could include some of those passages he left out, he edited out. And she said, well, no, that was his intention to leave those passages out. But then about a year later, I called back again. And she said, oh, I think they're so important you should include them. So I did. But I'm going just to read a few sentences from his interview. You all know who Galway was, right? You know, yes. He was just a giant in the literary world as a poet. He won every prize and award, if that makes, if that's important. But it was because he certainly kept writing in the stratosphere throughout his life. And I asked him if I thought I asked him if he liked being called a poet, and he responded this way: a poet should not call himself a poet. Being a poet is so marvelous an accomplishment that it would be boasting to say it of oneself. I thought this well before I read that Robert Frost took the same view. And I said, do you think it's dangerous to think of yourself as a poet? He says, no, it's not dangerous. One may hope that one is a poet or even believe it, but it's better all around if someone else declares it. That was just so refreshing to read after in the poetry world where lots of folks almost demand to being called a poet, or put so much weight on that identity. To hear that from Galway, and of course Frost said the same thing, was just very refreshing.
In the course of the interview today, he expressed what he would prefer to be addressed as, or
Galway.
What I did. Well,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, poetry was his life.
right.
But no, he didn't really want to be called anything, you know.
What was wonderful about him was the way he memorized poems.
Yes.
And read them. I remember when I was at Wesleyan, there a whole bunch of famous poets came through, and most of them were reading like this, you know.
That's right.
Face it in the book, and he didn't. He just sat up there.
I know. You know, he became pretty famous as a result of doing that, particularly reciting The Bear, you know. And it just, if more poets did that, more, you know, established literary poets did that, of course a lot of slam and performance poets do it. And more literary poets, if you want to call them that, should take that example. They should, I mean, it would change the whole scene of poetry in this country if more poets who were known for their work on the page recited their poetry, because it's it lives that way. It really lives that way.
Recited or memorized?
Memorized and recited it.
Do you think maybe the memorization comes from all the editing that goes into it?
Sometimes it depends on a person's memory, of course. And The Bear is a long poem, but Galway could go right through it, and it was just mesmerizing hearing him recite as opposed to reading it.
He must have been a good reciter.
Oh, he was great, yeah.
What I remember from listening to his readings, he was changing the poem ahead of himself as he was reading it. Every time, I've been to 3 of his readings,
Yeah.
and then every time he'd have a pencil in the other
No,
hand. He's changing the poem
that's
ahead of
interesting you
himself.
mentioned that, because he was revising. He used to drive Houghton Mifflin crazy. I mean, he would send in the final manuscript and then change something, and then it would cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars to change it, to make a final edit. And even if you buy his last book, Strong As Your Hold, you'll find that on the CD that's in the back, there are lines that are different than the lines that are actually in the book. So, like Emily Dickinson, he dwelled in possibility, and he was always thinking that. That's actually one main reason Dickinson never published. She felt her poems were always changing. There are 4 or 5 versions of almost all the same poems. So at the very end of this interview, I said in the last poem of your new book, it was new at the time, Strong As Your Hold, a poem titled Why Regret, you write, doesn't it outdo the pleasures of the brilliant concert to wake in the night and find ourselves holding hands in our sleep? These are actually the last 2 lines of the poem. They make the valiant claim that what means most to you, not the brilliant concert or perhaps poem also by implication, but waking in the middle of the night to find yourself holding hands with your beloved. And he said, is it a valiant claim, or is it a wonderful, surprising realization? Isn't to find in a moment that we who chose years ago to live as a couple are still thrilled to be with each other? Isn't that about the most blessed thing of all? And I said, yeah, and especially heartening to hear from someone who has achieved as much as you have as a poet. And then he ended the interview with this response: art is wonderful, but the moment love is smashed, darkness falls, deafness falls, nothing survives as it was. What a final comment, for a poet who had accomplished as much as he had. So I'll just read a few more. Do you folks know who Carolyn Forshey is?
Mm-hmm.
I did a long interview with her. She just didn't want to stop talking. But I'm glad she didn't. At the very end of this interview, I was asking her a question just about language and the efficacy of language as witness. And she said, language written in the aftermath of extremity. And by extremity, she meant extreme situations, war situations, politically oppressive situations. Language written in the aftermath of extremity bears the imprint of that experience, regardless of its content. It is that which is written out of that which was endured. In many respects, this is ineffable. The words come not from recollection in tranquility, but from wandering in a debris field. Beautiful, just summing up 100 pages of interview. I mean, if we just had that, it would almost be enough. Just read a few more passages. There are 10 interviews in here, but I'll just read 3 or 4. Do you folks know who Jane Hirschfield is?
Mm-hmm.
She was the easiest interview I ever did, just because she was so smart. And I mean, everybody's very smart in here, but she was just amazingly articulate and ready to speak about almost any subject. So I just say, Jane, what do you think about the weather today? And she would just reel off amazing comments and observations. So I asked her about her last book, which was called, or I think she's got a new one now, but it was called Come Thief. And I said to her, if she could just say a few words about it, try to sum it up. And she said, I had in mind many things, but especially an old Chinese teaching story. An old hermit returns at night from gathering wild greens for his supper, comes back to his small hut that has almost nothing in it, and discovers it's been robbed. But the thief didn't take the cast iron cauldron. It was too heavy. The hermit picks up the pot and goes running down the road yelling, "Wait, you forgot this!" I want to invite that thief into my life. The thief is the trickster, is love, is loss, is time, is aging, is whatever comes in, whether you think you want it or not, and leaves everything changed. Let's see, and maybe just one more quick one. This is from Natasha Trethewey. Do you folks know who Natasha is? She was the poet laureate of the country for 2 years, about 5 years back, and an African-American young woman who has just a formidable gift for writing formally about American history, and her last book called Thrall, Renaissance painting of mixed race figures that never really achieved enough prominence. So let me see. So her father, Eric Trethewey, was a professor at Hollins College for many years and was white, and her mother black. They divorced. Natasha's mother remarried and was murdered by her second husband. Mm-hmm. So she has some really powerful, especially a poem called Calling, about her mother. And so she's been wrestling with that trauma pretty much her whole life. She has a wonderful quote that she quotes from Yeats about that. She says, here, if I can just find that quote quickly. I think it's right here. The gist of it is that when you talk to yourself, well, I have to get it exactly. If I can't find it, I'll just move on quickly. Let's see. Well, I'll just read this quote and then I'll come back to that. So it's, she says, that's probably the truest thing, and that takes us back to what is true and the questions I ask in the poem Calling. And then what she's dealing with here is the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Why not make fiction, she says, of the mind's fictions? We know that the mind works instinctively to forget. We couldn't survive if there weren't things that we forgot. Then there are things that we try to forget but can't, as well as the things that we rewrite without knowing that we've rewritten them, and they allow us to have another truth. So my father's guilty of that. Certainly I am too. And when she's referring to here about her father is a kind of lot of sort of Southern mythology about just African American history, and there's specifically the notion that white blood makes black blood more pure. What is truest is perhaps not my recreation of the past, not an autobiography of my past, but an autobiography of my mind, and at this moment needing to make sense of whatever I recall and how I recall it. So she's been obsessed with trying to rewrite Southern history, a lot of which has been rewritten and changed as a result of really a lot of sort of racist thinking and mythology. She was from North Gulfport, Mississippi, which was wiped out by the hurricane, and so she's trying to revive that history. She's also, in her first book, or second book, Native Guard, trying to rewrite the history of African American soldiers whose loss has been forgotten, specifically this specific regiment that guarded prisoners in Mississippi. So she's really concerned with this whole notion of the meta, what she calls the meta-narrative, that sometimes creates a kind of pentimento of the real history. And she's written some beautiful poems about Enlightenment, The Age of Reason, and I encourage you to read her book or her poetry closely. She was just really fascinating to interview. I think that's it. There's just too much to read from that book. And this other book of interviews, Sad Friends, Brown Lovers, has wonderful stuff in it. Not so much from me, but from these poets I interviewed, Jack Gilbert and Maxine Kumin, most of whom are, Robert Bly is the only one still, and this was only about 8 or 9 years ago that I interviewed these folks. Donald Hall just died. It's very kind of sobering to think that many of those poets of that generation, the 20s and 30s, are now gone. Merwin's still alive, Bly's still alive, but not many others at this point. So I'll read a few poems and then again open up floor for some conversation. I think I'll start with a poem I haven't read before. It's sort of a longish poem about falling asleep at the sleep clinic up in Hanover. At the sleep clinic. I sat in the parking lot of the sleep clinic for an hour before my appointment, staring out at the mountains in the distance that appeared as gorgeous bodies in both prone and supine positions, inhaling the sky, dreaming themselves of all the ephemeral things the clouds inspire in their eternal pastime for now. How I got to this place is a mystery I can't explain. Call it exhaustion, providence, coincidence. The important thing was that I was there on a couple of planes at once, with an eye that was blind to itself in its socket of sky, but sharp in its vision of a hazelnut. I opened my eyes behind my lids and went on dreaming for a while, which was my only way of sleeping during so many years of nearly dying from suffocating in my sleep, which was why I was there, at the clinic, dozing off before my appointment. But back to the mountains, sky, and the goddess who suddenly descended on me from a cloud in the guise of the cloud from which she descended. Most beautiful Isis translating me on the Nile, because the parking lot was also the Nile, and she was the mother of time, and I its father who was playing dead, at least in my dream. Say it wasn't true, and I'll say it was because I believed it was, just as a child believes she can fly or disappear or metamorphose into a bear, and wears a costume to prove it, and has friends over who believe in her magic and take part in the scenes that she makes up inside the forest of her room. So yes, my make-believe was true if also ridiculous, a private myth with legs, and then right out of my dream and onto the page of sky for all to read and believe as a myth that was like a book of evening, beautiful but untrue, like a book on rising, beautiful and true. So, did I wake or dream? Ha! I slept, but my heart was awake. What I dreamed, and what I slept, but my heart was awake, was what I wanted to tell the doctor, whose name I had forgotten, that I was blessed in my exhaustion, tuned in to the blue beyond the clouds that transported me in a high oniric fugue, in which I could hear the songs that David heard in the hills, which had no words or speech, but only the silence that loves the company of a mind fused to sky. Only the heart divining the hum of stars. Don't give me gold but a piece of paper and pen, I said to myself as a snoozing cipher, because I was receiving news like a radio, tuned to a station on a cool, sidereal evening, when the stars are so incredibly bright they shine right through you, with the voice of an angel to your third proverbial ear. A phrase or two that seem absurd at first, but work surprisingly well as captions for the dream you're having about something mythological that is so weird in comparison to anything you've ever thought before, but seems particularly real right now, especially in the way it reveals just how besotted language is, with that as this and this as that, in the voices of your characters whose worldwide wings are bedighted with sacred feathers that fall like pages to the earth. I sat suspended between the dash and the heaven within me, calling it Father, calling it her, calling it nothing. It hardly mattered as long as it was other. Yes, the clouds are a lullaby, I continued. Yes, the zoo calls out to me. Yes, I took my meds, and no, they're hardly indeterminate, friend, these metaphysical puzzles that need a dream for you to figure out. They come in pieces like the clouds for you to see just where they fit together by closing your eyes and then remembering. But who was writing any of this down, my recitation? And how did I remember? And did you know the sacrifice I made by even talking to you in my diurnal slumber? Then suddenly the noontime whistle sounded, and I awoke from waking and opened the door of my car where Isis had rescued me in my dream, in which I had lain defunct in the dark interior of a cypress tree, where Seth had buried me. Emitting such sweetness she sniffed me out, so I could lay with her a final time on my catafalque, conceiving time, the ticking child, mewling babe. How alive and distant I'd been in death to the world that hangs like a jewel from the sky and lifts you up like a cloud into its blue when you dream of dying alive in your car, with the windows down and a warm spring breeze blowing through. Thank goodness, then, for the whistle at noon that woke me in time to save me from another wait of a month or two to see the specialist who thinks that I more than likely suffer from a pretty serious case of apnea, and would I mind spending the night in one of the clinic's rooms where his assistant, the brilliant Ms. Mattoon, can hook me up to an REM machine that measures my heart and dreams. Not at all, I said. By all means. I want to read a poem for, let's see, let me find it here. For a person who's here, if I can find it quickly. If I can. come back to that one. Since we'll read a short one called Small Black Eye. The sparrow lay stunned but still alive in the periwinkle, a victim of the window that appears as air in the kingdom of birds. I picked her up and placed her wing against my face as she came around. All the world, sky, grass, trees, shone inside her small black eye that was perfectly still as it stared at me like a stone that could see. We've all had that experience of a bird flying into our windows and lying stunned or worse in the periwinkle. I worked as a psychiatric aide for many years in New Haven on an inpatient unit, a research unit, where blood and urine were taken every day and put on a table at the end of the day in these containers. And my last day of work on this unit was the 3rd floor of Connecticut Mental Health Center in New Haven. I decided, kind of crazily myself, to pretend that it was happy hour. And that the table with all the urinals and blood was the bar. And just to see what would happen. So it actually happened. I made it up a little bit here. Do you folks know what ECT is? It's electric shock treatment. NPO, not by mouth. Those are just some initials, some acronyms in the poem. Happy hour. I stood behind the table of urinals on evening shift, my last day on the job, and turned this ward into a bar. Patients stared at me from the lounge and almost smiled. Listen up, I said, it's happy hour. All drinks are free. You're as crazy as we are, Robert said. Nancy laughed like a chickadee. Will it be, I asked. Rhoda was on an upswing, walking like a penguin down the hall. Give me a screwdriver, she said, to tighten my screws. Coming right up, I said. NPO for ECT, my dear. Better not. I'm getting a hangover that lasts a year. I asked Kenny if he wanted a gin and catatonic. Not funny, suddenly quiet. I was at an altar now instead of a bar. How about a lemonade or sarsaparilla? He stood as still as a mannequin against the wall and stared at something so far away it came too close to him. Alex stopped his pacing in front of the bar and stared at me. I pictured a worm devouring his brain like so many leaves. I'll take a daiquiri, he said, the first thing he'd said in days. I poured him a glass of air, which he took and thanked me for and drank, then handed back the empty glass. I poured one for me and held it high. L'chaim, I said, to you all. And also to you, Rhoda chimed. We'll miss you, dear. I drank as Alex did in a single swig, then put my goblet down on the bar and smelled that smell that was also mine. I had, for about 4 or 5 years, I had a grouse, a rough grouse named Randy. I named him. That befriended me. Just came out of the woods one day and just sat on my knee, and while I was gardening and raking, and he stayed around for about 5 years. He would follow me down to the garden, and he would climb on my shoulder and pull my hair out and peck the back of my hand. And
That's the picture that's on your website.
that's on the picture on the website, yeah. So so I'd walk down to the garden. I always wondered why he just didn't fly down there, because he would just run behind me. So I guess they're ground birds who love to run on the ground more than they loved, although they're magnificent flyers. So I thought I'd write a little poem for him that was actually a square dance call, since he seemed to love to dance, around me. So, do-si-do and say hello to Drummond Bird. Slow it down and pick it up once and a half, and let her go. It's right by wrong, you know. Turn to your left and freeze the dough. Promenade to the field below. It may be the last time, I don't know. I'll amend a right with Mr. Crow. You can't go to heaven when you carry on so. Yellow rock, red rock, oh by Joe. Dangle now outside the know. Timorous, beastie, beastie, oh. Let's see. I think I have another poem about a bird. It's impossible to not write about all the animals in the landscape of Vermont, you know, once you've lived here for quite a while. So do you all know what the state bird is?
Hermit.
The hermit thrush, yeah. So we have a hermit thrush that lives just in our woods. I never see him. So it's like, it's like Schrodinger's like, does he really exist, or is it just some mystical song coming from, who knows where? But that piping at dusk is just haunting. Just so you've heard it, right? Yeah. It's so beautiful. The hermit thrush is set for 6 to sing his song as if it were the end of the world. And he was stirred by dusk to sing the same sweet song again and again in the understory, as if to say, it's neither words nor meaning that matters in the end, but the quality of sound, as if we were deafened by the sun and needed his song as a key to unlock our ears, to hear and hear and understand, to see and see, knowing that this one day is the end for now, which it is. It is, he claims, with a song just loud enough to pierce the woods until the night descends like 1,000 veils, and then just one. Let's see. You've all probably been to the Putney Co-op. So, have you all read Allen Ginsberg's poem at a supermarket in California?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful poem, isn't it? So I decided we should have a poem about the Putney Co-op. That does justice to the Putney Co-op, or to a supermarket on the East Coast. This is a poem about the Putney Co-op, and I decided to call it an opera because every time I'm in there, I feel like singing. Should I do that? Should we do that? I mean, would you get kicked out if you just started singing in the Putney Co-op? No?
Depends on how you sing.
I know. Get out!
Depends on if you did it at Shaw's instead of the Putney Co-op.
That's right. So it starts with a little epigraph by Allen Ginsberg from that poem. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America of love past blue automobiles and driveways home to our silent cottages? He was an incredibly lyrical poet. He doesn't get enough credit for being a lyrical poet. At the Putney Co-op in opera. Go ahead, I say to my neighbor at the Putney Co-op, who tells me he can't complain. Let it out. It's mid-March, and there's still 2 feet of snow on the ground. Fukushima has just melted down, and the Washington Monument cracked at its pyramidion. Put down your bags and sing. How many times, dear Father Graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, must you walk down the aisles as a randy eidolon humming your tunes for us to start? Our song begins in silence and grows to a buzz. We make it up as we go along, and then watch our numbers swell. 10,000 members who have eyes to see and ears to hear, who fly like a swarm to join us in our chambers, which are these aisles. I'm singing without knowing it, carrying the tune of Maine things, lamenting the prices with Bernie Sanders. My neighbor joins me for no other reason than singing along as a member of the caste we call the multitudes of lonely shoppers. I roam the aisles with the sadness of America, juggling onions, blessing the beets. It's a local stage on which the country opens like a flower that no one sees beside the road. In my hungry fatigue, I'm shopping for images which are free on the highest shelf but costly in their absence, the only ingredient here that heals my sight of blindness. I see you, Walt Whitman, pointing your beard toward Axis Mundi by the avocados, reading the labels as if they were lines weighing the tomatoes on the scale of your palms, pressing the pears with your thumbs the way you did in Huntington, Camden, and Brooklyn. And you also, Ruth Stone, and Galway, and Hayden, at the checkout counter with empty bags you claim are full of apples, almonds, and bananas. What can you say to those outside who haven't read your poems, who find it hard to get the news from poetry, but die miserably every day for lack of what is found there? It's night. The Connecticut slips by across Route 5. The moon is my egg, and stars my salt. I score the music of the carrots, scallions, and corn in the frost of the freezer windows. The sough of traffic on 91 washes my ears with the sound of tires on blue macadam. The doors close in an hour. We'll both be lonely when we return on the long, dark roads to our silent houses. I touch your book and dream of our odyssey westward to a field in Oregon, Kansas, or California, where we plant our oars and die ironically, where we finish our journey as strangers in our native land. These are the lyrics to our song in the aisles, the buzz of the swarm with our queen at the center. What America did you have, old howler, when you scattered into the sky, then floated like a cloud as another form in the making outside of time, forgetful at last and empty of all you sang? I'll just read a few more, and then, if you would like to ask any questions or talk, I'd be happy to do that. Let's see. I was going to call this manuscript originally Return as Ticket. Does that make any sense? No. That's why I changed it. So, it does make sense, but you don't have to be in the bookstore to tell somebody what a title means, right?
Yeah.
You want them to get it, like, if you saw a book called Howl, you'd probably, oh, that's interesting, right? Or North of Boston, Frost. You know where he got that title? One of his best books. He couldn't think of a title, so he was reading the newspaper one day, and he just came to the real estate page, North of Boston. That's how he got the title. That's what poets do. Anyway, Return is Ticket. So I drive to Providence about twice a week. I commute to work down there, and often I forget something, like my wallet, or like a textbook, and I get on 91 and I realize I can't go to work without this, so I have to turn around and go back. You've experienced this? Have you ever experienced, on your way back when you're so frustrated, you see the landscape differently? You've just gone down this road, but on your way back, you have different eyes. You see the world differently. You think differently about where you've just been. And I view that return, that frustrated return trip, as a kind of new vision, as a new awareness about where I am and where I've just been. So return is ticket. When I'm forced to return home to retrieve something I've forgotten, I enter a double zone that's the same road I just went down, but am returning on now with an altered vision of its sameness that turns it into another road, which is so different I hardly know what to call it, as I speed forward in heading back, taking in everything that's so familiar, the fence posts, pasture, elms, and burdock, as suddenly strange through the lens of inconvenience. It's almost a dream, but not really. More a consequence of accepting my mistake, which allows me to turn in turn to see, if even briefly, so many things I've hidden, as if my mind needed to forget to save my heart from the haste that governs my life. Something shines in the distance. I call it the lamp of internal difference that needs the spark of my seeing anew to light its mantle. Then everything I see I know was once forgotten and lay in the dark behind the light. I hear the cries of them all as parts of the whole in the sough of wheels, in the absence of the single thing that I've forgotten, and then the loss of those I can't redeem. They are the songs as well that quiet the hum of a powerful engine and slap of tires on the wet macadam. I notice, too, that the cobalt sky has now become the vault for all I feel on the road of my remembering. It's my ticket for the matinee of my own showing, this turning back to fetch my wallet. This foreign film I title Late Again, with burning captions. So I think I'll stop there and just ask, if you want to, have you any questions or requests or whatever?
I had a
Yeah.
question about your writing process.
Uh-huh.
For example, the last piece that
Yeah.
did anything come to you at the moment, or did it kind of fester for a while and then you got this line and the whole thing started to unravel?
I think I thought of that title first, returning as a ticket to something else, because often we feel we're wasting our life if we have to wait an extra amount of time in the doctor's office or turn around and go back. But those, ironically, can be some of the most fertile times in your life for thinking about things that you otherwise wouldn't think about because you're just feeling so frustrated about having to wait an extra hour or turn around and so forth. So
So in that sense, you're turning the negative
exactly,
into positive.
exactly. I had no idea I was going to get a poem out of it, but that's the risk you take. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
My sense is from listening to the poems that you read is that you like many poets, you start with an incident, or at least a moment or something like that.
Yeah.
And then, let me know if I'm wrong here, but then over time you sort of riff on that moment and you sort of add and kind of go see how far it will go.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I often sort of free associate as well, just to play with language, which I did quite a bit in that at the sleep clinic poem, where I try to trust in as much as I can in my unconscious, and create what Robert Bly used to love to call leaping poetry. That has a strange glue in it often, where disparate appearing images suddenly hold together, in a kind of lyrical magic, and just hope that I can create that kind of alluring language that is more often unconscious sometimes than conscious. Yeah, but yeah, it could be a tiny thing like forgetting my wallet, or listening to the hermit thrush, or just taking glee and watching my pet grouse, hop behind me. That seems so just minor or quotidian at first, but are gold as far as if you start to write about them and see where they take you.
So my sense is that here's part one of the incident, here's part two and part three and part four, and in between there are all these kind of I won't call them digressions.
Well, they are kind of, but I mean,
because it always comes back to the.
Well, I hope so. That's kind of the discipline of writing. I mean, for every one of these poems, there are 20 or 30 pages, notebooks and notebooks of what you're calling digression. Yeah. And so the distillation of that, And then you never know then, you know, if you've got something. You know, as Galway sort of implies in that quote I read, it's completely up to the reader in the end, or the listener, whether or not that language is crossed over, whether a transpersonal self has succeeded in entering the listener's ear in a way that he or she wants to remember that.
But for many poets, I think they're happy with one sort of, I'll call reflection on some incident that happened to them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's just reams of poetry being written today that blurs the line often between journal entry and poetry. Yeah, yeah. And I know when I interviewed Maxine Kumin, who was a wonderful poet over in New Hampshire, what she thought about all the poetry that was out there now. I mean, more poetry being published than ever before now because of the internet and desktop publishing and such. She said, I think it'll all be sorted out somehow in the end. But I don't know. There's just so much out there. And so the readers have to be have to be disciplined and thoughtful about what they're picking up, because you could just end up reading pretty mediocre stuff forever if you didn't create, if you didn't think carefully or read criticism about poetry. So I don't know, I don't know what to say to the reader exactly, except trust yourself to become a careful reader and an intelligent reader.
You know what Bly used to say? He says, okay, read the poem, and if something grabs you, then hold on to it and read it again. But if there's nothing there that...
Well, that's a good, simple way to put it, yeah.
There's nothing there that,
yeah.
that you feel inside.
Yeah.
Go on to the next one and forget it.
Exactly. Felt meaning. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I really love the sleep clinic poem. It seems so elegiac and wandery, and I was just thinking,
yeah,
insomnia in a way was so tied in with your process for so long. Were you concerned about having, being cured of your apnea or whatever, that you would lose that dreaming time?
I know. I know. I was really just exploiting that experience. But it became a kind of conceit or metaphor for mining the liminal, that's like awareness. And I want to fall asleep at night, and remember as many dreams as I can. I have one of those machines that helps me do that. But, but you can mine that gold that's during the day.
If you structure your day.
Not just if you structure your day, but also if you just are careful not to become overly conscious and self-conscious about your writing process.
Well, it seems like the returnist ticket and the insomnia are both loss of control, basically.
Yeah. So
and because you've lost control,
you
have to look at everything in a different
That's
way.
right. So it's one of those ironic truths about poetry that if you lose control, if you, as Keats would say about negative capability, learn to exist in uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, what emerges is gold, is magic. You end up writing Ode to a Nightingale. Do I wake or do I sleep? Actually, that's the epigraph of that poem. Yeah. So, Michael.
First, thank you. This was wonderful. So, a question: who and/or what are you reading now?
That's a good question. I try to read poetry all the time, but I also love to read history. I'm reading a book by Christopher Wren right now called The Turbulent Sons of Freedom. Do you know this book? Do you have it? Probably here in the bookstore. It's by a guy named Christopher Wren, not the architect of, when was that? The 18th, 17th century, whatever. But he must be related. Anyway, he was a journalist for the New York Times who's written an incredible book about the Revolutionary War in Vermont, in Ethan Allen. And it's just an incredible book about what it was like to be in Vermont in 1776, 77, 78, and what the folks up here endured, the old growth they cut down, the roads they made, the cannons they hauled up hills, the battles that they were, thousands of troops killed, the working with the Native Americans, but they were also working for the other side as well, and just all of the ambiguity and horror and disease that took place right here. It's just been a real eye-opener. But as far as poetry, I've been reading Donald Hall's new work. He's got a new book out called A Carnival of Losses, and which is not poetry, but just came out. Let's see, what other? I'm reading a lot of manuscripts that people have sent me lately for blurbs, but that nobody would know about, so I have to work on those.
Who's the newest, biggest surprise you found that you weren't aware of that just suddenly caught your eye?
You mean as far as?
Or poetry, let's say.
There's a wonderful African-American poet named Tahimba Jess who won the Pulitzer Prize this year. I don't know if you know his book. It's just so musical and powerful and works on the page and as oral poetry as well. He's been wonderful. Tracy Smith, the new poet laureate of the country, is a wonderful poet, and if you get a chance to read her work.
My degree is in astrophysics, so she keeps
Oh,
catching.
that's right. That's right. Let's see. I don't know if you know the work of Vijay Sahadri, he who lives in Vermont here. I should mention this book is just out. You guys familiar with this book at all? This is a anthology that I just put together with Sid Lee, the former poet laureate of Vermont, that includes Vermont poets since Robert Frost, folks who published at least one book and have lived in Vermont for 5 years. There are about 100 poets in here, but just wonderful stuff. We left out about 7 poets, and so we had to do a second edition that included them. Do you folks know who Ron Padgett is?
Yeah.
So we left him out. So we've included him now. So he's happy. He was a little upset. But that's what happens in Vermont. There are poets who come up here and they hide. And they live in New York or Boston, parts of the year. He wrote the poetry for that wonderful movie called Patterson. That Jim Jarmusch made, if you get a chance to see that. It's just, did you see it?
Oh yeah, it's the best movie about poetry.
It's great. So anyway, he lives up in Calais. There are lots of poets who live in Calais who are hiding. And David Hinton lives up there. Do you know who David Hinton is? He's the foremost authority in the world on classical Chinese poetry. And he's just written a wonderful new book called The Wilds of Poetry, which I encourage you all to read. And he teaches at Columbia. He drives down once a week. And he's married to Jody Gladding, who won the Yale Younger Poets Prize many years back, and is a terrific poet who now is in charge of the Vermont studio, and is director of that. So Vermont is just chock. Grace Paley lived here, and of course Louise Gluck lived here. Ellen Bryant Voigt still lives here, and Ruth Stone lived here. Moved up here because she thought the Vermont mountains reminded her of her Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, where she was born. So we're just so lucky to have, the literary tradition we have here. Shall we just end with one poem and then move on? You've been a great audience. Thank you for coming. I'll just read one more from this most recent book, which came out in 2015. Maybe I'll read. This is a poem that Ruth Stone inspired. She's in that first anthology of, or interview book. And when we used to visit her about once a week for the last 3 or 4 years of her life, maybe once a month, and it depended on my schedule. And she was in bed for the last 3 years of her life, listening to P.G. Wodehouse. She had a great sense of humor. You all know who Ruth Stone was? She was the poet laureate of the state also. Just a real treasure, national treasure as well as a state treasure. And she'd always say, I'd say, what do you, I said, Ruth, how did you come to write a particular poem? You know, like 1941, or Ah was another one, or The Train, or all these incredible poems that she wrote. She said, I didn't write them. I said, well, who wrote them? She said, I don't know. They just came to me. I said, I'd hear them coming across the universe like a freight train. And if I didn't run inside and write them down, they'd be lost forever. She said, but she never took credit for writing them. And I always thought that was wonderful. Of course she wrote them, but she just felt like Galway. She felt like she couldn't take credit in many ways for writing. And so I wrote this poem in her voice. This is close to the way she felt, or the way she talked to me about her poetry, called The Gift. All I did was write them down, wherever I was at the time, hanging laundry, baking bread, driving to Illinois. My name was attached to them on the page, but not in my head, because the bird I listened to outside my window said I couldn't complain about the blank in place of my name if I wished to hold both ends of the wire like a wire and continue to sing instead of complain. It was my plight, my thorn, my gift. The one word in 3 I was permitted to call it by the muse, who took mercy on me as long as I didn't explain. Thank you.
Chard, what was the title of the Christopher Wren book?
The Turbulent Sons of Freedom. It's actually a quote from somebody that in the book, I can't remember who.